What I have here is what happens when an extensively experienced audio designer decides to lean on some old school principles to make a pure Class A headphone amplifier with no holds barred. And specifically, I'm talking about the Schiit Mjolnir 3. This is a $1,200 headphone amplifier and preamplifier that aims to compete with some of the very best in the business by doing it a bit differently. And so I was really excited to get my hands on one of these. I want to start out by saying a huge thanks to channel patron Aaron. This is actually his Mjolnir 3. He had it shipped directly to me from Schiit Audio, and so he's never even seen or heard this one yet, other than right now. And so I want to say a huge thanks to him for making this review possible. And in fact, I want to take that a step further and say that if you would like to say thank you to Aaron with a donation, I'm going to put a link down below through to my PayPal account. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you do want to send a donation to Aaron, if you make sure to put in the comments or the reference for the PayPal donation, if you put Aaron's name in there, so Aaron, then any money that comes through that PayPal account with the reference Aaron will go to him. And so I know that's a bit clumsy, but I don't have a better way to do it that keeps it as a surprise for him when he first sees this video. And so again, link in the description down below. Make sure that you put the reference that it's for Aaron, and I will send any and all of those funds along to him as soon as I get them. So Aaron, thanks again. Now let's do a really quick introduction of the basics that you need to know, and then jump straight into sound quality before we come back around at the end and talk about a device tour, what I like, don't like about the interface, and using and living with the Mjolnir 3. I've already said to you that it's a $1,200 headphone amplifier, and for that money, what you're getting is a true Class A, always Class A amplifier. For those that don't know what that means, it's generally considered sort of the purest way to do amplification. It's less efficient, but the sound quality is often considered to be better. And to give you a quick idea of power, but I'll give you more specs about it later, it gives you 2 watts into a 32 ohm load. And so that means that the Mjolnir 3 is going to comfortably drive things like Susvara's, Abyss 1266. Whether or not there's synergy there, we'll get to that later, but there's enough power. As for the Modhouse Tungsten, I'm not so sure about that one. I am in conversations with Ryan from Modhouse about getting one out for review. I'll talk about it more then. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to test a tungsten on the Mjolnir, and this will be in Aaron's hands by the time I get a tungsten, so I can't answer that one directly. On paper, it's probably borderline whether it can do it. If you've heard a tungsten from a Mjolnir 3, let us know in the comments, was it the single-sided or the double-sided version of the tungsten, and how did it go? But for now, let's jump straight into sound quality, because I know that's what most of you are here for. And the very first thing that stood out to me when I plugged this in was that the sound is just enjoyable. It's clean, it's punchy, it's got that Schiit Audio sense of energy and dynamics to it that I really enjoy about their sound, but it's also done in a very neutral, very transparent way. What I mean by that is it hasn't got the thickness of something like an Asgard 3, which I really enjoy. It hasn't got that thickness. I think it's more tonally balanced than a Jotunheim 2 as well. It's a very kind of true to source headphone amplifier in my opinion. That doesn't mean it lacks weight and presence and impact and fun, but it does it without colouring the sound. It does it through its sense of authority and punch, rather than any particular coloration that I could hear. And in fact, one of the tests I did was to take the Cord TT2 as the DAC feeding into the Mjolnir 3, and listen to the headphone output running from the TT2 as the DAC, and compare it to the direct output using the headphone sockets on the TT2. And I'd say tonally, there's basically no difference. And what I mean by tonally, I want to make this bit clear. What I mean is there's no sense of extra treble, extra bass, extra mid-range, but there is a slight difference in the character, as I'll describe in a second. The key point is this isn't rolling off treble, it's not raising bass, it's not thickening the sound up, it's just delivering it with a slightly different sense of character to the different sounds. And even then, that's very, very slight. For example, I do think there's a very teeny tiny amount of grain in the treble from the Mjolnir 3. I can't put my finger on exactly what's causing it, but it just has a very tiny bit of grain compared to, say, the direct output from the TT2. It's not to say it's bad, it's not to say it's harsh, it's just got a slightly different character to it. Some might call it more textural, I think it's just a little tiny bit grainy. And keep in mind, I have been trying to turn this video around fast, so that might also dissipate as the unit gets burned in, the capacitors, the resistors settle down, etc. And it's so subtle, it's not a reason that I would ever criticise the Mjolnir 3, I'm just trying to pull out points of difference. Another thing that I really like is the sense of bass depth and presence is absolutely fantastic. So the bass is weighty, not enhanced, but weighty, and it goes all the way down with a sense of control and authority. Mid-range comes across just natural and well balanced. There's nothing that stands out about the mid-range from the Mjolnir 3, and that's fantastic. You don't want mid-range coloration that you notice from a headphone amplifier. You want it to get out of the way, at least in my opinion. And then finally, if we talk about soundstage, it's wide, it's deep, it's just spot on. I really enjoy the staging from this as well. And so in isolation, listening to it all by itself from the TT2, I was really impressed with what I was hearing from the Mjolnir 3, particularly for a $1,200 headphone amplifier. It was ticking all the boxes. But it is worth noting at this stage that that's just in one mode, because the Mjolnir 3 has a couple of different modes you can use. As I said, I'll do a full device tour at the end, but there's two modes that are worth talking about here, and they're both controlled from switches on the front panel. One of them is that you can run the internal circuit in a push-pull mode, which basically means that you've got active signals on the positive and the negative circuit, or you can run it in a single-ended mode, which basically means that you've got the active signal going to the positive side of the headphone driver, and then just a return path on the way back that's not being actively driven. And so you can choose between those two. There's also then a feedback on or a feedback off mode. And so let's start by talking about the push-pull versus single-ended mode. In the literature from Schiit Audio, they basically talk about this as being there to give you some extra power. It's going to give you more power on tap. I'm assuming that's to reach the full 2-watt potential of the headphone amplifier. And it's worth noting here, we're talking about power, not gain. So when you throw this switch, you don't get more volume. It's just going to give it the ability to drive harder headphones. And so if you do find that the headphone amplifier is starting to sound a bit rough, if you're driving a more difficult headphone load like a Susvara or a 1266, the push-pull mode is going to keep the volume the same, but give it more power on tap to help control those more difficult headphones, or to help drive those more difficult headphones, I should say. It's not about control, it's about driving it without stressing out the amplifier and therefore causing distortion. Having said that, when you switch that switch, it does change the character of the amplifier just a little bit. And what I felt, and I was using, I think, the Focal Utopias for this test, but it doesn't matter so much which headphones you're using. What I found was that when I used it across different headphones, it makes the sound just a little bit more forceful. And I don't necessarily know that I like it. I don't dislike it, but I don't like it more than single-ended. And the reason for that is that as I switch between the two, the single-ended mode is just easy to listen to. Particularly things like vocals are just effortless and smooth and natural. When I went into push-pull mode, there's a very, very subtle difference that if you didn't kind of know what you were listening for, or if you didn't know the switch was being flicked, you're probably not going to hear it or notice it. But if you do quickly switch between the two, the mid-range just gets a little bit more forceful, like the singer is trying a little bit harder, like the amplifier is trying a bit harder, I guess. And it just makes it a tiny bit less natural. No, not natural's the wrong word. A tiny bit less easy to listen to. To be really clear here, it doesn't change detail, resolution, texture, tonality, staging, anything. It just changes that little bit of character in the sound, and as I said, it just comes across a tiny bit more forceful. And so for me, I would use it in single-ended mode always. By the way, that doesn't mean that you can't use the XLR output. The single-ended mode is about how the internals of the amplifier are working to drive the signal, but you can still connect to either the XLR or the single-ended socket or both in either operating mode. And so just to summarize, if you don't need the push-pull mode, I think the Mjolnir 3 sounds better in single-ended. And that means that for 90%, 95% of headphones on the planet, you're going to be able to leave it in single-ended mode, and I think that's where it sounds best. If we then talk about the feedback mode, just to give you a quick idea of what that's doing if you're not familiar with feedback, the idea of feedback is that it basically takes the signal and it routes it back around on itself to try to cancel out noise, distortion, etc. Now that's a very, very simplified version of what it's doing and how it's doing it, but that's the concept behind it. And there are people like me who generally find that we prefer a zero feedback design. I've just started looking into this recently as to why this might be, because there are a lot of people out there that will say that feedback is a good thing, you want to remove distortion, it's going to make for a cleaner signal, and there's definitely some truth to that on one hand. But what I've started to understand and learn is that the feedback process can actually start to smear the very, very fine detailed timing of the musical signal. And the moment we do start to smear that timing, and we're talking down to kind of microsecond type levels, and so what tends to happen is that we don't really hear any difference in the tonality, resolution, or detail, But what it does start to do, and this is true here as well, is that when you switch the feedback on, it takes away some of the clarity and detail of the soundstage and the image properties. And specifically what that turns into for a listener is that when you switch the feedback circuit on in the Mjolnir 3, it flattens the stage and it reduces the ability to separate the sounds in space. To be clear, it's still an excellent sounding amplifier with feedback on, but it's not as good in my opinion as with the feedback off. Now for those of you that are all into measurements, I guarantee that the feedback on mode is going to measure better, and some of you will therefore say that it has to sound better in that mode, but to my ears, the spatial qualities, the depth, the layering, the separation, and the image focus, all of that is better with feedback switched off, and as I understand it, it all comes down to that smearing of very fine detail timing information. I'm hoping to produce some videos in the future that dive into some of these really technical topics in a bit more detail, whilst hopefully still keeping them simple. But for now, I'm going to leave the feedback discussion there and say that, to me, this sounds best with feedback off, for the reasons I've already said. The nice thing is, you can switch it on and off at your leisure and make your mind up for yourself. And so we still have to talk about the preamp performance, the single-ended versus the XLR output performance, and then of course some comparisons to see just how this stacks up in the realm of really great headphone amplifiers. Before we do though, I just want to quickly thank today's channel sponsor, and that's Aura. Aura is a provider of online security and protection services for your data. And so that means they offer services like VPN, password manager, spam protection. They will clean up data that's being sold of yours around the internet and potentially even the dark web. And the nice thing is that they bundle all those services into one single location, whether it's their website or an app on your phone. And so if you're currently using all different service providers for your VPN, your password management, other online protection services like antivirus, then Aura could be a good solution for you to simplify everything and bring it into one single app, and more importantly, bring it down to one single price. So you're not paying sort of $12 here, $15 there. You can bundle it all up into a single price to a single provider and keep things really simple. Of course, the other thing is you might not be using any of these protection services at the moment, and that's where it's really important to think about a provider like Aura. So if you'd like to investigate and see how much of your information is out there on the internet, how many different data brokers are currently selling your information to get you spammed, to potentially end up with you scammed, or even have identity theft occur, and by the way, Aura does offer identity theft insurance. If you want to look into that further and you're in the US, then viewers of Passion for Sound can get a free 2-week trial. All you need to do is go to aura.com/passionforsound and sign up for a free 2-week trial where you can get online, you can see all the information and data that Aura is able to find out there in the world that you don't want out there, and then start helping you clean it up today. And so again, for your free 2-week trial, just go to aura.com/passionforsound. And thanks again to Aura for sponsoring today's video. And so now back to the Mjolnir 3, let's talk about the preamp performance and the front outputs performance. The first thing I want to talk about is the preamp, and the great news is that the performance from the RCA and or XLR outputs on the back are just as good as the headphone stage. It is worth noting that the feedback circuit still works for the preamp stage, but in my testing, you may or may not hear it quite as effectively through an external amplifier. And that's because the downstream amplifier is going to have its own versions of feedback and or its own distortion that it's going to add to the sound again. So you do still hear the benefits of the feedback or the drawbacks of the feedback depending on how you look at it, but it's to a lesser degree than what I found playing with the front sockets. Once again though, I just think it's better without feedback on. I think it's all more natural, easy to listen to, and more importantly, that sense of space and accuracy in the soundstage is better. And so essentially translate everything I've said about the headphone outputs over to the preamp outputs, and that's great. And then coming back around to the headphone sockets, comparing the XLR and the single-ended output, for me showed that there's a little bit of a difference. And generally on higher end headphone amplifiers, I find myself thinking they're different, but not necessarily that one is better or worse than the other. However, on the Mjolnir 3, I do think the XLR output is a little bit better. Not to the degree that you shouldn't use the 6.3mm output, it still sounds fantastic, but I think the XLR is just a little bit better still. Where things get a bit tricky though in the testing is that every time you switch between them, you have to match the volume because you're going to get more output power from the XLR, and therefore every time I switched, I had to try to volume match. And if you don't precisely volume match, you do hear the sound differently. The dynamics change, our ear's perception of things like bass and treble change, and so it was very hard for me to tell if there truly was a difference. But going back and forth many times, I must have done it half a dozen times, I consistently felt like, for some reason, the XLR was just giving me slightly punchier bass. Not that it was giving me necessarily more bass, although the perception was potentially that it was a bit more, but it was more about the fact that it had more impact and more authority in the bass. Again, this could come down to a very slight variation in volume, even though I tried to volume match, and if anything, I tried to give a little bit more volume to the single-ended output on the second or third round of listening, just to see if that would shift things in the other direction. But I did consistently feel like the XLR was just a hair better. I also felt like the XLR was giving me a better sense of separation of sounds. That's not uncommon. And that's partly because with the XLR output, it's giving you completely independent positive and negative for left and right channels. Whereas when you go through the single-ended connection, the 6.3mm, the left and the right negatives are sharing a common ground, and that does produce things like extra crosstalk, where the two channels do start to overlap and merge a little bit. Again, that's a horribly simplified version of it, but the point is you don't generally get as good separation because you're sharing common signal pathways in a 6.3mm connection. So it's not completely surprising that the XLR is better, but it did surprise me a little bit that it wasn't one of those where I went between them and went, yeah, they're different, not so much one's better or worse. On this occasion, I would prioritize the XLR where possible, but I wouldn't be at all upset if I had a headphone that only had a 6.3mm connection. You're still going to enjoy wonderful sound out of the Mjolnir 3. However, that brings us around to the biggest question of all. And that is, I've said this sounds fantastic, but I've only listened to it on its own so far. So how does it stack up to the competition? And I'm going to jump straight to the level that I think it starts to really compete at. I listened to some amps at lower levels, things like the Aune or Aune, I think it's actually meant to be, S17 Pro, that review's coming up very soon. I listened to the Mjolnir 3 up against things like the S17 Pro, and for me, it is a no contest. The S17 Pro is a good amplifier, I'll talk about that in its full review, but the Mjolnir 3 does perform better than that. And so where it really started to compete, where it started to kind of meet its match a little bit, was with the Burson Soloist 3X GT. And not just the regular 3X GT, but the fully upgraded 2023 version with the upgraded power supply modules and the supercharger power supply. And so we're suddenly talking about a $1,200 headphone amp going up into the $3,000 range. This for me is where it met its true competition, but let's talk through now kind of the pros and cons of each of these different amplifiers, other than the obvious being the cost. Now for this testing, I was running my PC via a Curious Evolved USB cable. That was going out to the Schiit Yggdrasil OG version, and from there going through a set of Super Sword XLR cables into the GT and into the Mjolnir 3, and driving the Mesa Elites with the angled Alcantara pads. Now, of course, I've used a bunch of different headphones on the Mjolnir 3. There wasn't a single headphone I connected them to that I didn't enjoy them with, but this testing was with the Mesa Elites. I had the Mjolnir 3 set up with feedback off and in single-ended mode, and of course I was using the 4-pin XLR output from both amplifiers. As always, I listened to a bunch of tracks, but the one I made my notes on was I Won't Complain by Benjamin Clementine. And starting off with the MJ3, this track was fluid, it was easy to listen to, it was engaging, and it was never ever boring despite being easy to listen to. So when I'm saying easy to listen to, that doesn't mean boring, rolled off, smoothed off. It just means it wasn't harsh, the music flowed, and it was natural, but very engaging. Jumping over to the Soloist GT, and that brought up the clarity a little bit. That was probably the biggest difference between the two for me, was that there was a little bit of extra texture and resolution coming from the Soloist GT that the Mjolnir 3 couldn't quite keep up with. Listening to the piano at the beginning of this track, and the Mjolnir 3 gave me a little bit less sense of the percussiveness of the piano. It still has wonderful articulation, but I didn't get as much sense of the energy of the hits of the pianos, and that's partly due to the textural elements, kind of those transient moments of the song, or transient moments of the piano at least. And I don't mean emphasize in terms of it's overly emphasizing it, there's just a different character of the two amps. Thinking about the vocals, and the MJ3 gave a little bit of extra presence and weight to Benjamin Clementine's vocals, whereas the Soloist GT has a character that comes across a little bit V-shaped. Very, very subtle, but the mid-range doesn't have the weight that the treble quality kind of demands to really balance it out perfectly when you're comparing the two. Now, both of these are top-tier sounding headphone amps without a doubt. And so I'm splitting hairs here. I don't think you could go wrong with either of these, but I think the vocal from the MJ3 was a little bit more natural. The other thing that bit of extra weight in the mid-range did from the MJ3 was it helped to separate the vocals a bit more. By giving the vocal more presence, you could better define it in space, you could better understand where the vocal was and where the other instruments were. And that meant comparatively, the GT sounded a little bit flatter overall, less depth, less layering and less separation. Once again though, I was noticing that the GT was showing me more details and textures and resolution in the sound, and so it was giving me a little bit more insight into some of the subtle characteristics of the instruments, the room, the space, not in terms of this size of space or the imaging, but in terms of how it sounded, how the different frequencies were being represented, how the different textures were lingering. That was a little bit clearer from the Soloist GT. But I think the MJ3 was giving me a more natural overall sense of the soundstage, despite lacking a little bit of that detail, by a very small amount. One moment in this track that really helped to define the difference between these two for me was that at about the 1 minute 35 mark, there's a kind of a climax in the phrasing where Benjamin Clementine sings I Won't Complain with quite a bit of force, and then there's no sound for a moment afterwards. When he hits that loud, climactic vocal moment, the decay of that note came across more natural from the MJ3. In the case of the Soloist GT, I felt like it was just clipped off a little bit too fast. I didn't get the sense of the natural lingering sound, that kind of almost the space around the sound was better from the MJ3. And so as I went back and forth over and over across different tracks, it's very hard to separate these two. I couldn't stand here and say that on pure sound quality alone, one of them is better or worse. They both have their other strengths in terms of the Soloist GT has more inputs and outputs. It's got multiple gain modes. It therefore gives you lots of different volume options. It's got a display, which some of you might prefer. It's got crossfeed. But then on the other hand, the MJ3 here is $1,200 US. It's also not got a fan in it, which I know is important to some people. And yes, I will talk about the heat of this one soon. And so each of these amps does have its pros and cons. Ultimately for me though, based on my note-taking from that particular track, I was dead split on these two. They both were doing some things fantastically. And so I moved through a bunch of other tracks to try to help separate these and split them to help you make your decisions. And don't worry, I am also going to talk about some other amplifiers as well in a moment, but just sticking with the Soloist GT and the MJ3 comparison for a sec. When I went over to music like electronic music, the sense of impact and control and presence in the bass from the MJ3, for me, gave it the edge on electronic music over the Soloist, which is already, again, very, very good in that space. Across a wide range of genres, I do think the MJ3 consistently gave me a better sense of soundstage, particularly soundstage depth. And then when I got to orchestral music, this got really interesting. On orchestral music, I loved the soundstage size and shape and scale from the MJ3. And so I was definitely leaning towards that initially. But then when I went over to the GT, I was really enjoying the sense of texture and clarity that it was giving me, where I could hear more of the sound of like a bow biting against the string, or I could hear more of the texture of the brass instruments. Whatever it is, I was able to get more of those nuances from the GT. However, as I flipped back and forth between the two, and from memory it was a violin solo or something that really tipped me over the edge here, and for me it was the naturalness of the MJ3 that won me over. I would happily trade off that little bit of texture and resolution for the fact that it sounded like a real violin I was listening to out of the MJ3. Whereas the GT in comparison, and I can't stress enough, this is about splitting hairs to help you make decisions. In comparison, the MJ3 was just that little bit more natural. And that then carried through to listening to some jazz. The tonality, the presentation, the sense of presence and space was always more natural on real instruments in particular. It really stood out on the MJ3. What I mean by real instruments is on acoustic instruments that were mic'd and recorded, the MJ3 was rendering them in a more natural way that made me feel like I was in the room listening to the instrument, as opposed to listening to an exceptional recording from the GT. And in fact, one of the notes that I made was that it sounds like cymbals. So when someone hits a cymbal and there's that bit of shimmer and decay from a cymbal, the MJ3 captures that, renders that in a way that I don't think that the Soloist GT can quite match. And I think this could come back to that whole feedback question. I'm pretty sure that the Soloist GT range use feedback, whereas we know for a fact with the switch off that the Mjolnir 3 isn't. And these are these tiny little cues that our ears use to put together the sound and to understand the sound, That's where I do think the MJ3 is that little bit better, because it's not getting in the way of those natural sounds. It's letting them come through, it's letting us perceive them, and the reality is that the worst measurements are at a level that our ears aren't going to tell the difference between, but they are going to pick up those tiny, tiny differences in timing based on the research I've been doing recently. And so after lots and lots of tossing and turning between these two, the MJ3 for me is actually the better amplifier than the Burson Soloist 3X GT. And that's a big statement because I love the Burson Soloist range, particularly the GT. The Mjolnir 3 is just mind-blowing with what it's doing at the price. It's an incredible, wonderful headphone amplifier. And so I wanted to do a quick test against a couple of other headphone amps that I have here to see if this is the best amplifier under a certain value. And one of the other amps that I've reviewed relatively recently and also really enjoyed was the HiFiMan Golden Wave Prelude. This is another very similar amp to the Mjolnir 3 in the sense that it's a discrete design. I think it's $2,500 off the top of my head. And I think from memory it's also Class A. And again, it went head to head for me with the Soloist GT. And I felt like the Prelude actually got closer to the MJ3 in terms of those elements like transparency and realism. However, I also think it had a slightly thicker sound overall, a slightly creamier sound overall, you could call it. It's not super thick, it's not completely lacking in resolution or anything like that, but I think things like image separation, soundstage, image focus, the MJ3 still pulled ahead in those areas. And so as I went through all the different headphone amps I have here, there are only 2 headphone amplifiers in my collection that really prove competition or possibly better than the MJ3. And they're the Enleum Amp 23R, which is vastly more expensive. It is also a speaker amp, so we need to take that into account. And the other option is the Linear Tube Audio MZ3. And the reason is that both of these, at least I think the MZ3, I haven't checked this, I know the Enleum Amp 23R is a zero feedback design, and I think the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 might be as well, but I would have to look into that. The key thing for me though is that both of these amps give the same sense of realism and transparency that the MJ3 does, and then they're possibly a little bit better in terms of things like resolution, in terms of soundstage size, detail retrieval, etc. But at the same time, by the time you get to those levels, you're spending a whole lot more money, and or, in the case of the MZ3, you're getting less power. And so what that tells us, where that leaves us with this, is that for $1,200, the MJ3 is ridiculous. It is performing at 3 times its value almost. Maybe not quite, but pretty close to it. It's an astounding piece of engineering and design in my opinion. It's not perfect. It has got a couple of very minor issues that I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of pure sonic enjoyment, I think it's phenomenal. And I have to say, I came into this a little bit skeptical. I'd seen and heard some of the hype out there, and I do always wonder when people start talking about $1,200 amplifiers in the same breath as $3,000 and $4,000 amplifiers. I always come in expecting that to be a little bit of hyperbole. But on this occasion, I don't think it actually is. And so if you are in the market for a headphone amp, and everything I've said about the Mjolnir 3 would work for you in terms of its features and its functions, and again, we'll get into the device tour in just a second, I think the Mjolnir 3 is an absolute beast and an absolute bargain. At $1,200, this thing has no right sounding as good as it does. And so if you are in the market, if you're interested in this one, if it's going on your bucket list perhaps, let's now talk a bit more about the features and functions that it has as well. I've already mentioned that it's a Class A amplifier. I've also already said that it gives you 2 watts into a 32 ohm load, and it's going to maintain all the way up to 1 watt into a 300 ohm load. Now that may not sound like a lot, but any 300 ohm headphone that I've ever checked out needs nowhere near 1 watt of power. Most of them are going to actually give you dangerous listening levels from just 100 milliwatts. So having 1 watt on tap is more than you need for any 300 ohm headphone that I know of. And then as I said before, it's still going to have plenty of power for those difficult planar magnetics such as the Susvara and the 1266, unless you're doing crazy things with EQ, that might stretch it a little bit. But the only headphone I can think of where this might tap out is going to be something like the Tungsten. A couple of other things about the design that I didn't get into before is it's running a dual mono approach. And what that basically means is that you've got completely independent and discrete circuits for the left channel and the right channel. And that means that you've got an optimum design for both channels, that they're not crossing over at any point in the signal path, and that's partly how we're getting such wonderful separation and clarity of the sound. I've already mentioned that it's a zero feedback design if you want that. It's switchable, as we've said, and also that it's got a push-pull or a single-ended design in terms of the way it's driving the power. And so they're the basic features and specs. Let's do a quick chat about the layout of the amplifier with a quick device tour. And I'm going to start with the top plate. When I first looked at this in pictures and online, I'd never realized that the top panel is actually a window or like a vent into the amplifier, and then we've got 2 heatsinks over there. I'd always thought this was 4 different heatsinks or something similar from my first glance, but that's what it is. It's 2 heatsinks and a vent into the actual circuitry. Now, while we're looking at this, it's worth mentioning that this does run hot. It's a Class A amplifier. But the good news is that the only bit that gets really hot that you don't want to touch are these actual heatsinks. The rest of the casing is generally pretty comfortable to the touch. I've run this for quite a while. It's a stinking hot day here. I might even be sweating. I don't know if you can see it, but the casing itself doesn't get particularly hot. The heatsinks, on the other hand, you don't want to put your hand on for too long. They do get very, very hot. Along the front panel, we've got some really simple switches, typical toggle style switches from Schiit Audio. It's great, it's quality, it's a good way to interact with an amplifier. And what we've got as we go along is we've got an input switch, so you can choose between the RCA or the XLR inputs on the back. We've then got our preamp on or off switch, so if you want to run this as a preamp and a headphone amp, you can just switch to the preamp on mode or switch it off again. Now, switching to preamp on mode doesn't disable the headphone outputs, so do keep that in mind. You may still want to unplug your headphones. But the good thing is that if you're running a pair of active monitors, for instance, then you can just simply switch this switch down and the actives won't be running. And then when you're ready, you switch it on and away go your actives. So that's nice having that ability to switch that rear output. From there, we've got a really nice volume control here. As far as I know, it's an analog 4-gain control, meaning that it's got independent channels for your left positive, left negative, right positive, right negative to maintain that full dual mono design. We've then got a gain switch. I haven't moved this out of low gain once because I don't have any particularly difficult headphones here. We've then got our switch to go between single-ended mode or push-pull mode. And then finally, we've got our feedback off or feedback on switch. And then, as we've already touched on, 6.3mm or 4-pin XLR outputs. If we swing around then to the back, things are really simple back here. We've got XLR and RCA inputs and XLR and RCA outputs, a power switch and a main socket. So it's a very simple amplifier in the best possible way. Schiit haven't over-engineered this. They've just applied all of the knowledge they've gathered over the years and extensive experience they have and pulled out an absolute ripper of a product, in my opinion. And so the final thing that I do want to mention that's a very, very, very small drawback with the Mjolnir is that because it's running internal transformers and chokes even, and I don't know if the chokes contribute to this or if it's just the transformers, but I have seen a number of reports online, and I've definitely noticed it here, that when you switch this on, it does have a very, very slight mains power hum, so 50 Hz or 60 Hz depending on where you are. And then on top of that, when you touch the amplifier, it does vibrate just a little tiny bit. Now, exactly why that is, I haven't looked into. It's not a hum to the level that I think it's going to be a problem for anybody once you listen to music. It's quieter than something like the fan in a Soloist GT as a comparison point. And so the moment you start the music, you're never ever going to hear it. And indeed, if you're in a normal room with normal kind of ambient background noise, that's probably going to be enough to mask the sort of sound you're getting out of this. Computer fans, air conditioning, general household noises are going to be louder than the hum from this, but it does have a slight hum if that's a complete turn off for you. But having said that, if that's the worst thing I can say about a $1,200 headphone amplifier that's competing with $3,000 headphone amplifiers, then I think we're doing pretty well here. And so I'm going to wrap up here by saying again what I probably don't need to say, which is that I think the Mjolnir 3 is absolutely fantastic, to the point that I'm thinking about buying one for myself. So thanks, Aaron, you've just cost me 2,000 Australian dollars. But I think it's going to be worth it because it is an amazing, amazing headphone amp. And I think for value for money, it's absolutely out of this world. So if you're on the fence, if you're considering buying one of these, just go ahead and do it. And with that in mind, I hope this video has been useful and helpful in helping you to make that decision. And as always, if it has, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.